Bailey had lost her entire litter just weeks before. Her body still carried milk. Her eyes carried more. When the abandoned tiger cubs were placed beside her, no one knew what she would do. Would she ignore them? Attack them? Instead, she laid down, let them feed, let them curl into her ribs like they'd always been there. She had lost her own. But in that moment, she chose to love again. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The sky over Fairview, Tennessee, was soft with overcast light, as if the clouds themselves didn't want to rise that morning. A cold mist slithered between the pines surrounding the Fairview Wildlife Rescue Center, dampening the wooden walkways and turning every breath into vapor. It was the kind of morning where the silence held a weight, and even the animals seemed reluctant to stir. Sarah Delaney stood at the observation window of the maternity wing, arms crossed over her chest, eyes locked on the tigress behind the glass. She was tall and lean, with a long, tired face and gray strands streaking her black hair, all tied into a loose ponytail. Her fleece jacket was dusted with straw, and she hadn't touched her coffee since the sun came up. It was her 13th year working in wildlife rescue, but she had never felt quite as helpless as she did now. Inside the enclosure, the Bengal tigress named Sahara paced like a ghost through the straw. Her massive body, painted in sharp orange and white with jet-black stripes, moved with a restless, agitated grace. Her amber eyes flashed not with maternal warmth, but wild confusion. She had given birth hours ago, 2 tiny cubs, barely larger than house cats. But instead of licking them clean or nudging them toward her belly, Sahara had recoiled. She sniffed, growled, and turned her back. "They're getting colder," said Craig Bennett, a young handler with wind-chapped cheeks and an anxious edge to his voice. He stood beside Sarah, clipboard forgotten in hand. "They're hungry," Sarah replied softly, "but she won't let them close." Sahara had been rescued from a roadside zoo in Georgia 2 years ago. She had grown stronger, healthier, but never particularly affectionate. This was her first litter, and some instinct inside her had failed to ignite. Sarah knew the statistics. Cubs rejected at birth had a poor chance of survival without immediate intervention. Bottle feeding could sustain them physically, but the lack of maternal contact often left long-term emotional damage. They became aggressive, unpredictable. The center's mission wasn't just survival, it was rehabilitation. "We could try formula," Craig offered half-heartedly. "We can try something better," Sarah murmured. Then, almost on instinct, she turned her head toward the hallway. And there she was. Bailey moved down the corridor with the quiet dignity of someone who no longer hurried. Her steps were slow, one paw dragging slightly from an old hip injury. Her thick German shepherd coat, mostly black, with grizzled silver spreading around her muzzle, shimmered with the kind of wear only time could give. She didn't bark, she didn't look panicked. She just appeared. Bailey had once been a mountain search and rescue dog in Colorado, famous among teams for her discipline and intelligence. But last year, her service ended abruptly after her body failed to recover from a dangerous winter deployment. She had been brought to Fairview to retire in peace. But retirement didn't bring peace. A month ago, Bailey had given birth to a litter of stillborn pups. Her body had prepared for life, only to be met with silence. Since then, she had withdrawn into herself, still gentle, still obedient, but different. Her eyes were darker, her breaths slower. She slept near the door, facing out, as if waiting for someone who never came. And yet now, her ears twitched toward the sound of cubs crying. "She shouldn't be walking around so much," Craig said, half rising. Sarah raised a hand. "Let her come." Bailey approached the enclosure slowly. Through the glass, she could see the cubs, two fragile bodies curled against each other, whimpering without a response from their mother. Sahara stood in the far corner, tail flicking. Sarah knelt to Bailey's level. "I know you lost yours," she whispered, placing a hand gently on the shepherd's head. "But maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for you." Bailey pressed her head softly into Sarah's hand. Minutes later, the team prepared a transitional enclosure, neutral ground, sterile, safe. Sahara was guided away under mild sedation. The two tiger cubs, Blaze and Autumn, were moved onto a padded heat mat, their tiny rib cages rising with each weak breath. Bailey entered the room with no command. She walked to the cubs, sniffed once, then twice. Her ears perked, her eyes softened. Blaze mewled. Autumn lifted her head weakly. Bailey lay down beside them. At first, the cubs only squirmed. Then, by some ancient instinct, they began to root against her belly. A hush fell over the room. Craig leaned forward. Sarah didn't breathe. And then they latched, Blaze first, then Autumn. Bailey winced slightly, but she didn't move. Her body adjusted. Her breathing steadied. "She still has milk?" Craig whispered, incredulous. Sarah nodded. "She lost her pups only 4 weeks ago. Her body hasn't let go yet." Bailey let her head rest on her paws. The cubs nursed in silence, their cries fading, their tiny tails flicking ever so slightly with life. "She's letting them feed," Craig said, almost breathless. "She's really doing it." "No," Sarah said. Her voice caught in her throat. "She's becoming their mother." The mist outside thickened, and the wind stirred the pines beyond the glass walls. But inside that small, quiet room, a miracle was taking place. A mother without children. Children without a mother. And something ancient and divine knitting them together, not with words, not with instincts alone, but with love that simply refused to die. The nursery had grown quieter in its own sacred way, not because life had diminished inside it, but because something tender had begun to bloom. 3 days had passed since Bailey first opened her body and her heart to the orphaned cubs. What began as instinct had settled into rhythm. What began as an act of compassion had become a way of being. Bailey, the old German shepherd with silver at her muzzle and a history written into every slow step, had claimed Blaze and Autumn with unwavering devotion. She nursed them patiently, even when their tiny claws dug into her skin. She licked them clean after feedings, corrected them gently when they grew too wild, and curled herself around their striped bodies each night as though they'd always belonged to her. She did not bark when they bit. She did not flinch when they scratched. If anything, she seemed to cherish the pain, each tug of fur, each awkward pounce, a sign that they were growing stronger. Her eyes would close, not in weariness, but in peace. As if their warmth beneath her chest was the answer to a question she hadn't known she was still asking. Blaze, the larger of the two, had begun to test boundaries. He would stumble away from her side, attempt a baby growl, then trip over his own feet in a tangle of overgrown paws. Autumn was more observant, often following her brother, but always looking back to check if Bailey was still there. She always was. Across the room, near the far wall, a boy sat cross-legged, notebook open in his lap. Owen Rivers, age 11, didn't speak. He hadn't. Not for months. Not since the fire. But he came to the nursery every morning, sat in silence, and watched. He watched the way Bailey tilted her head when Blaze tried to climb her shoulder. He watched how Autumn nestled into her side when the sun dipped and the room turned gold. He watched everything. And slowly, he began to write. At first, they were simple observations. Bailey doesn't sleep unless both cubs are under her. Autumn blinks more than Blaze. She's more careful. Blaze fell today and Bailey licked his ear after. I think that's her way of saying, "You're okay." Then the notes became more personal. I think Bailey misses her babies, but now she doesn't look sad anymore. She lets them bite her. She doesn't get mad, not even a little. Mom gets mad when I bite my pencil. Then drawings appeared. Rough sketches of a dog curled around two cubs, one where Blaze stood on Bailey's back like a mountain climber, another where Autumn stared up at her, wide-eyed, as if waiting for permission. Owen never showed them to anyone, but the notebook grew heavier in his hands. He didn't speak, but every day his breath came easier. His shoulders dropped lower, and once, when Autumn mewed unexpectedly loud, he had smiled just briefly. It vanished in seconds, like a bird taking flight. But it had been there. Bailey noticed him too. Sometimes she would raise her head when he entered, eyes soft and unreadable. She never approached, never barked, but she watched him with the same patience she gave her cubs, as if she understood that he too was healing. The days folded into each other, and love quietly built its nest in the corners of the nursery. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant, quiet, real, love without boundaries. Morning at the Fairview Wildlife Rescue Center began with frost on the windows and the smell of hay warmed by the breath of animals. The nursery room, once a place of careful silence, had become a small theater of life, full of soft noises, tumbling bodies, and the heartbeat of a new kind of family. Blaze and Autumn had grown noticeably. No longer the size of kittens, they now resembled small jungle explorers, paws too big for their legs, shoulders broadening into the promise of wild power. Blaze was bold, always the first to pounce, climb, and tumble. Autumn was quieter, but clever. She studied before she acted, eyes alert, often correcting her brother's reckless moves with a gentle paw or a low growl. At the center of it all lay Bailey. Her once sleek coat was starting to mat at the joints, and the silver on her muzzle had spread along her cheeks. She was slower now, but still attentive. The German shepherd's ribs rose and fell with the steady rhythm of guardianship. Her ears twitched with every sound, every paw step, every breath. If the cubs strayed too far, she shifted her body to bring them close. If they wrestled too hard, she separated them with a look. And when they curled against her again, she would sigh, not in exhaustion, but in quiet contentment. Across the room, Owen Rivers sat in his usual spot, cross-legged, notebook in lap. His notebook was fatter now, the pages smudged and curling at the edges, full of pencil sketches, observations and questions only he asked in silence. He had begun talking to himself while writing, not full sentences, just whispers. A word here, a name there. A quiet chuckle when Blaze tripped over his own feet. Sarah Delaney noticed the shift. She'd grown protective of Owen in her own quiet way, watching from the observation window like a shepherd watches a storm cloud pass. She still wore her old fleece jacket and kept her pencil tucked behind one ear. Sarah had always carried her grief inward ever since the accident that took her husband, but Owen reminded her of someone who wasn't broken, only paused. And she knew, from her own life, that sometimes healing didn't announce itself. It just came in small, trembling steps. That morning, something happened. Blaze had been stalking Autumn, his idea of play, when Owen leaned forward a bit too quickly and his notebook slipped from his lap. It landed with a soft thud just inches from the cubs. Autumn startled but didn't move. Blaze froze. Then, to everyone's surprise, Blaze padded toward the notebook. He sniffed it once, then gently took it in his mouth. The boy didn't move, didn't reach. He just watched with wide eyes. Blaze turned, trotted back, and laid the notebook beside Owen's knee, tongue hanging out, tail swaying slightly. Owen blinked. Then he laughed. Not a shy giggle. Not a whisper. A real laugh. It burst out like something he'd been holding in for too long, like the first ray of sun after a long, bitter winter. It filled the nursery and spilled into the hallway. Sarah, frozen behind the glass, looked at Craig, who had just walked in with a bucket of fresh bedding. "Was that?" Craig began. Sarah smiled. "Yes." Inside, Owen was still laughing, holding the damp notebook and wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Blaze had sat beside him now, puffed up with pride. Autumn, curious, came and laid her head on Owen's other leg. Bailey lifted her head and looked at all three with the patient, quiet knowing of a mother. That afternoon, as the light dipped behind the treetops, Sarah sat on the bench outside the nursery. She hadn't written in her journal that day. Instead, she watched Owen from the bench as he helped refill the cub's water bowl with Craig. He wasn't speaking full conversations yet, but he asked for the scoop. Then he said, "Autumn likes the cold corner," and later whispered, "He gave it back to me," as if no one else had heard. But Sarah heard, and she wrote those words down when she got home. That night, Bailey rested her head over both cubs, who were now too big to fit neatly beneath her but still tried. Owen sat nearby, legs stretched out, humming a quiet tune his father once sang when driving at night. No words, just notes, cracked and soft. He didn't know Sarah stood at the door, watching. She placed a hand gently on the frame and whispered to herself, "Love without fear." Change came quietly to Fairview. The leaves had barely turned gold when Sarah Delaney stood at the edge of the nursery enclosure, hands tucked deep into the pockets of her fleece-lined vest. Through the reinforced window, she watched Blaze and Autumn circle each other in play. Their bodies, once small enough to fit beneath Bailey's chest, now filled the space with raw muscle and quick paws. They leapt higher, wrestled harder. Bailey, ever patient, could no longer keep up. It was time. For safety and for space, the decision was made. Blaze and Autumn would be moved to a larger outdoor enclosure near the tree line, a space built to simulate the edge of the wild. They needed room to grow, to stretch their legs without breaking walls or furniture. Bailey would not follow. Her hips had grown stiff, her steps slow. She still lifted her head when the cubs growled or tumbled too close, but she no longer rose quickly. She no longer chased. Her breathing was heavier in the mornings. The work of motherhood, unexpected and unconditional, had taken its toll. She had done more than anyone expected. So, the team at the rescue arranged for Bailey to be retired into a quiet foster home in town. A warm place, with blankets by the fireplace and a fenced yard for short walks. Somewhere she could rest. Somewhere she wouldn't be alone. Owen didn't speak much when he heard. He stood in the nursery that last morning, arms at his sides, watching as Bailey licked Autumn's ear one final time. Blaze nudged her chest with his nose, as if trying to understand why she didn't rise. Bailey closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Then she let her head rest gently on her paws. Owen's face didn't change, but that night he began to write. "Dear Bailey, the nursery is too quiet now. Blaze and Autumn keep looking around like they're searching for your tail. I keep thinking I'll see you curled by the door. They say you're doing okay. I hope that's true. I miss you already. Love, Owen." And he kept writing. Every week for 2 years, Owen folded his letters and gave them to Sarah, who made sure they were delivered. Sometimes the letters were short, just a sentence, or a small drawing of a tiger paw in Bailey's shadow. Other times, they filled pages. He told her about school, the first time Blaze caught a rabbit toy in the enclosure, how Autumn liked to sleep under the same tree every afternoon. But always he wrote them the same way, addressed to Bailey and signed Your Boy. He didn't talk much in those 2 years, not like other kids. He smiled more, nodded more. But words stayed rare, only the letters held everything he needed to say. Some days he'd visit Blaze and Autumn and just sit, watching, remembering, hoping that somewhere Bailey was lying in a sunlit patch of grass, remembering too. Because even when someone leaves, the love stays behind. And even after 2 years, Owen never missed a letter. The 10th anniversary of the Fairview Wildlife Rescue Center arrived on a wind-brushed spring morning, the kind where sunlight filtered through pine needles like golden thread, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted lazily across the fields. Volunteers bustled between enclosures and tents, stringing banners and arranging folding chairs beneath white canopies. Tables were lined with framed photos, old newspaper clippings, and hand-painted signs that read, "A decade of second chances." Sarah Delaney stood near the main tent, clipboard in hand, her signature ponytail pulled higher than usual. She was dressed in her cleanest boots and a green jacket with the center's logo stitched over the heart. Despite the noise of the crowd, her eyes kept drifting toward the tree-shaded clearing where 2 full-grown tigers lounged in their wide forest enclosure, Blaze and Autumn, now 4 years old, majestic and commanding in every line of muscle. But something in their eyes remained unchanged. Something soft. Behind Sarah, Owen Rivers adjusted the collar of his button-down shirt, fidgeting in the crowd. Now, 13, he had grown into his frame, still quiet, still watchful. His brown curls were a little longer, his hands a little steadier. He wore glasses now, and though his voice had begun to settle, it still trembled when emotions swelled too close to the surface. He held a folded speech in his back pocket, a speech Sarah had helped him practice for the last week. "Are you ready?" she asked gently. Owen looked up at her, then toward the path where a silver van had just pulled into the gravel driveway. He nodded once. Inside the van sat Bailey, older now, slower. Her coat was more gray than black, and her eyes had dimmed, not from loss but from time. But when the door opened and the breeze carried the faintest scent of pine and tiger musk, her ears twitched. Her head lifted. Ellie Talbot, the elderly foster who had cared for her these past 2 years, stepped out after her. A small woman with a floral scarf tied around her neck and kindness etched into every wrinkle, she helped Bailey down gently, murmuring encouragement. Bailey took a moment to steady herself, then began to walk. Owen watched her every step as she moved slowly up the trail toward the tiger enclosure. Blaze and Autumn had been kept behind the second gate as a precaution. After all, they now weighed over 300 pounds each, their shoulders nearly as tall as Sarah's chest. "She might not remember," one of the volunteers whispered nearby. "She might get hurt," another murmured. But Sarah said nothing. She just watched. Bailey reached the first gate, and for a moment she simply stood. Inside the enclosure, Blaze lifted his head. Autumn stood fully. No one moved. Then Blaze padded forward, slow but certain. Autumn followed, silent as a shadow. They reached the second gate and pressed their foreheads gently to the steel mesh. No snarling, no growling. Bailey took 2 more steps and stood inches away. And then it happened. Blaze let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a warning, not a growl, but something like a purr and a sigh combined. Autumn made a quiet chirping sound, almost kitten-like. The gate opened. Gasps moved through the crowd like wind through leaves. Bailey stepped in. Blaze approached first, lowering his massive head. He nuzzled her neck, then turned and rubbed his body gently against her side. Autumn pressed close, her tail flicking, her breath slow. Bailey stood perfectly still, then licked Blaze's face once, then autumns. They lay down together. Not in fear, not in caution, in peace. The old shepherd curled into the space between them, as though no time had passed at all. Owen didn't realize he was crying until his mother touched his hand. He stepped onto the stage as the crowd quieted. He stood in front of a microphone, unfolded the crumpled paper from his pocket and looked out, not just at the guests, but at Sarah, Craig, Ellie, and the tigers beyond. He didn't read from the paper. He looked up and said simply, "2 years ago, I lost my voice." Bailey gave it back. She didn't look like me. She didn't sound like me. But she raised the ones who needed her, and somehow that included me. Some people think love only belongs to those who share blood, but I know better. I know love can be chosen, and I know family doesn't need matching fur. The applause came slowly, then rose like thunder through the trees. That evening, long after the crowd had left and the tents had been taken down, Bailey rested between the tigers in the fading light. Owen sat just beyond the enclosure, sketchbook open on his lap. On the page, the silhouette of a dog, flanked by 2 striped giants, all curled in the shape of a heart. Sometimes the greatest miracles come not with thunder or lightning, but in the quiet moments when an old dog becomes a mother to 2 wild hearts, or when a broken boy finds his voice in the warmth of love he never expected. Bailey didn't look like a mother to tigers. She wasn't strong anymore. She wasn't young. But what she gave, patience, protection, love without limits, was more powerful than instinct. And through her, God showed us that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choice. It's about showing up when no one else does. It's about love that doesn't keep track of differences, only of needs. In our everyday lives, we often miss the small sacred moments where God is working quietly. A hug that comes when we need it most. A phone call that saves us from loneliness. A second chance we didn't earn, but we're given anyway. This story is a reminder. Miracles still happen. And God still speaks, sometimes through a child's laughter, sometimes through the steady heartbeat of an old shepherd dog. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that love still wins. Leave a comment below and let us know how this story moved you. And if you believe that love, true, sacrificial, God-given love, can cross all boundaries, type Amen in the comments. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us that we are never too broken to be loved and never too small to make a difference. May God bless you and those you love,